Hello again, this is Ed. I want to welcome you to week 7, the last week of our course. I hope you found our course uh, engaging, informative, educational. I realize parts of it may have been a bit challenging, but any learning and activity that we undertake, typically, if it's worthwhile, is. So again, I hope you found it both engaging, informative, and in some ways a little bit entertaining, with especially some of the videos. So let's talk about our last week. We have just one chapter we're going to review. I want to make sure you have more than ample time to work on your final draft of your term paper. We're going to be looking at chapter 18, and I focus on this last chapter because it is one that we as leaders in any organization will continue to be dealing with for, really every workday that we have. It's just inevitable, and that is the concept of change. There's a lot of other sayings associated with change. If you're not changing, you're dying. Change can be very positive. It can also be very stressful. Hence, we have stress management tied in with this chapter as well. We'll talk about different concepts associated with change. We all go through a human cycle when we're dealing with some change. If it's minor, it's relatively easy. If it's major, then we typically see a pretty standard response to significant change. There's a model that's not talked about in your book, but it's one that's worth reviewing. It's called the Kubler-Ross model, how humans react to, significant change or significant trauma. And, typically, and I'll paraphrase it, the cycle is first shock, then disbelief, can't believe this is happening. Emotions, then anger, sadness. Typically, though, anger will come out of that because the person's going to say, why is this happening to me? It's not fair. Then there's a process where we begin to self-validate, begin to acknowledge that the event is actually occurring. We then begin to formulate ways of constructively dealing with it. And, of course, the last phase is we move on. The problem with that cycle is while most people do work their way through what I just described, it's very easy and common for people to backtrack, to fall back to an earlier phase, or get stuck in a phase. I'm sure you can think of people who had something significant happen and they never left the anger mode. They continue to dwell in that area, and what's sad about that is without moving on, that event then begins to overshadow and take over the life. So again, we'll talk about the concept of change and the importance of, for you as a leader, helping guide your organization through that process so that people can reach a healthy spot of moving on, accepting the change, and making it work. Part of that is understanding the different change models that exist. One of the most well-known ones is by an individual named Kurt Lewin. Back in the 1940s, he created a 3-step change process that most people refer to as freeze, unfreeze, and then refreeze. So it's basically many organizations are frozen in status quo. His model talks through how you go about thawing that environment, using that as an analogy if it was an ice cube. Thawing it so that it can be reformed into a different shape. And once you have it in the shape that you want it to be, then you refreeze it and then move on with the new organizational culture. Second model we'll review is Kotter's 8-step model. That is really, of all the models I've seen, that Kotter model is one that I've seen adapted more than any other change model in multiple organizations. They may not call it the Kotter model, but if you're familiar with the 8 steps, you see the change process the organization's using, you can very clearly see they utilize his material and slap their own label, their own corporate name on it. But it's the Kotter model in many, many cases. It's an excellent model to use if you have some significant change to make. I strongly suggest you become well versed in that change model. Now I've attached the article that he wrote back in 1995 in the Harvard Business Review for your review in week 8 as well. moving on to the concept of stress, I mean, the key thing there is there's really two different types of stress, positive and negative. Positive stress is usually referred to as eustress. It's E-U-S-T-R-E-S-S. Stress is healthy. And while it typically has a negative connotation, stress is healthy for us as individuals if it's leveraged and used in a positive way. So for example, I like to exercise. I don't do enough of it. I need to do more. But exercise is a form of stress that has, overall very positive benefits. It helps strengthen your muscles, your ligaments. It helps provide more flexibility for me as an individual. And it always does, puts me in a better frame of mind and then gives me more incentive to live healthier, eat better, and it usually snowballs. I'll usually look to exercise more when I start to see the positive results. Negative stress, though, has an opposite effect. When you have stresses in your life, it's important that you think about how am I going to deal with this anxiety that I'm feeling, and endeavor to try to utilize positive ways of dealing with it. Because if you don't, then the negative ways of reacting to stress come about. Anger with other individuals. Person may turn to different types of narcotics or drugs or alcohol, none of which have a positive effect. And it usually then snowballs in the opposite direction, where it just creates more and more stressors on the individual until they break that negative cycle. So it's important that there's a positive cycle that's put into play, and it's one that you have to consciously and cognitively think through to make sure you're taking the right approach. We'll also talk about additional tips on how to deal with stressors and how to help people in your organization manage stress as well. This being our last week, we do have 2 DQs. Again, they're going to this discussion question number 1 is constructed to help you again utilize the concepts in your term paper. We're going to talk about what change model would you recommend be used in Brazil, and you could obviously easily incorporate that into your final term paper. And then the second DQ is just briefly talking about concepts that you believe you've learned in this course that will aid you in your career over the next decade. The paper also ties into key learning concepts, and I'm asking you to reflect back on the last 7 weeks. Don't just paraphrase what you did in the DQ. I'm looking for more of the deeper concepts you've learned that you believe you can incorporate into your personal makeup as well, that you'll make them part of your normal approach to dealing with individuals, groups, teams, and organizations. So again, if you can make that thought process on concepts you want to integrate into who you are as a person, then ideally you'll remember those concepts and apply them in the years forward. Of course, we have our final paper due this week. That's important you submit on time. Once the class closes, I won't be able to accept them. You can, of course, submit it early. Early is good. I can provide the grades back to you sooner, but it's really, really important you submit that final paper before our class closes. Because once the class is closed, I won't be accepting late papers. So make sure you get them in on time. Again, I hope you've enjoyed our course. If there's anything that you think I could do to improve it for future sessions, please include that into your weekly paper or your discussion question. And I sincerely wish you all the best of luck on your future career endeavors. Take care.